Yeah, there was a movie. You probably missed it because Jaffro's a bad YouTuber. I am. I failed, and I encourage all of you to go out and fail. It's how we learn. Let that video remain a public example that I'm not perfect. It's public in the Galant playlist and in my uploads, but no subscription notification was ever sent by YouTube. A lot happened since I saw you last. This place is destroyed. Just got power back on. I've been working hard on this Galant. I'm rebuilding it. So, sorry you missed the other update. You can go back in the feed and watch it. And you should. Just because I screwed up and didn't check a checkbox that's now grayed out, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It's the perfect companion to this one. Don't be mad that you didn't get a subscription notification. Be happy that you now have 2 videos to watch. This video isn't complete without it. So go ahead, we'll just sit here looking at this engine we pulled out of the Galant and waiting for you to catch up. I want you to savor this. It took 30 years to create this mess. You can't buy this in a can. You can't smear this on for theater. The nests and vegetation stashed throughout this car are specific to the region in which I live and can't be reproduced the same way anywhere else. This is something that only time can create, and it's more unique than any Rembrandt. You can copy a painting, but there will never be another mess like this one. Happy birthday, number 1229. What I want to do here is 4 things. Separate the engine from the transmission, get this engine off the floor and onto the engine stand, clean it all up, and break it down so that we all get our eyes on its starting point. From what we see here, we know that before this car spent half of its life as a sitter, it spent 15 years as a driver. I don't know if the numbers match, I just know that it's all 100% complete. So what we learn here will determine the direction of this build. I'm pretty sure at least half of you want me to make a long aftermarket parts list like the one that I'm using for my GSX. Well, rather than get into specifics about the changes I'll be making in this video, I'd rather highlight that this car is already a masterpiece and doesn't require me to re-engineer anything. Its power plant and bones could push well over 400 wheel horsepower if I changed nothing at all and just added enough boost. And all the necessary modifications to support that have already been done to this car. They're tastefully selected, handcrafted modifications, and I'm not replacing them. They're already the perfect complements to everything Mitsubishi did right, and I can't improve on them. Or most of them. Between custom-made and out-of-production parts and an original JDM antique, there's a whole lot here that deserves reverence. And then there's that other original thing that needs to be replaced so that I never have to spend 3 hours on an exhaust flange to change the oil again. Just look at that oil filter housing. It's growing fur. My Hyundai's not the only one that leaks, obviously. The alternator vents here are all clogged up with belt dust. Anyway, I'm the person who installed most of the modifications on the outside of this engine for the previous owner. So now you might have a better understanding of why I want to keep them. They're actually a part of my history from 20 years ago too, and represent him well for caring enough about the car to buy all of them. I know someone else went through this car before he bought it, and that at the very least it had the head off, so I have no idea exactly what I'm going to find inside of it. I just know that the more original it is, the less likely I'll be willing to change any of it. All I can see on the outside of this is that there's a whole lot of RTV everywhere, and it leaks from everything. So let's go ahead and get moving so we can do those 4 things. I need to get the transmission off, so the low-hanging fruit is the clutch cover plate. There's 3 bolts connected to both the bell housing and the block, and it would get destroyed if you tried to disconnect this part last. So it goes first. Next up are the transmission bolts. There should be 4 of them left because we already took the starter off.
There's no crank lock bolt.
You know, I get to own this one right here, right now. This is my fault. I'm the one who put this transmission in the car. I'm not going to make excuses. This was totally my fault. What I do know is that the transmission wasn't installed for very long before the car was parked, and all the other bolts are still very tight. I'm going to get some of these brackets out of the way. They don't need to be there. I was amused by Mitsubishi's use of grade 11 fasteners on all of the mount and brackets. I don't own a 1G, and perhaps other 6-bolt cars are also like this, but my junkyard build Hyundai certainly isn't. The ones on my Hyundai all look like the ones on my 2G. This Galant looks like the engine mounts and cross members are all held on with flywheel bolts. I love it.
Oh, yeah.
This thing's stuck on there good, man. I tried impact extensions, breaker bars. and finally found the right combo.
Yes! Woo!
These victories require a little bit of smack talking afterwards, but the truth be told, I busted my ass off camera.
Yes!
Now, let's get this transmission off of here. Because the cover plate is gone, all the bolts are out, and the clutch disc isn't seized onto the input shaft, so I just put it on the ground and wiggle it around a little bit and it pops right off. Nice and easy for once. In order to attach the engine stand, I have to take the clutch and flywheel off first. So I remove the 6 clutch bolts gradually in a star pattern at first. You drummers know what I'm talking about. Once all the spring tension's removed, I just go all the way around it. This is an ACT 2100 pressure plate. The clutch is brand new, and it's why the transmission was previously removed. The owner got tired of the ripped clutch leg syndrome caused by the 2600 and downgraded it. So naturally, it's in perfect condition. It's perfectly flat. No concave wear pattern on the pressure plate surface at all. It's just freshly broken in. You can see the street disc looks like it just came out of the packaging. This is great stuff. All the Galant VR4s with this body style have 6-bolt engines. And for everyone out there who wants to know the difference between a 6-bolt and a 7-bolt, it's the number of bolts that attach the flywheel to the crankshaft. So that right there is what tells you. The 6-bolt blocks have wider main and rod bearing journals than the 7-bolts. Aside from a little surface rust, this flywheel appears to be in perfect condition. Freshly resurfaced for that new clutch. I don't have to do anything to these parts. Next goes the transmission spacer plate. I always like to remove the rear main seal housing bolts before attaching the engine stand, except for that one video where I didn't. Naturally, my engine stand is always in the shape of a 4G63 because I own 5 of them. That always makes this simpler. But, you know what makes things really complicated? This! That right there is responsible for all of this. It's ridiculous. 500 pounds is hard to push uphill when the thing that you're pushing has a steel spike stabbed into the concrete. I eventually got it with techniques learned from the Egyptians, but totally by myself. I only wish my camera batteries had lasted longer. Now, some of you are going to find this strange, but I'm going to clean this engine before I disassemble it. I've honestly never done it in this order before, but this time I have a lot of different reasons for doing it this way. I'll know every part a whole lot better if I do. If I remove the outside filth first, I won't track it onto the inside, which is of course getting cleaned anyway, but I also have to handle expensive camera equipment, and the less rancid this thing is, the cleaner my hands will be. One of the added benefits of doing it like this is that I'll be able to bag and tag parts that are already clean and ready to install instead of putting greasy things in bags that I'll still have to clean and rebag again later. It's one of the most tedious parts of an engine rebuild, and front-loading my misery onto this job will give me fewer excuses for procrastination later. As we dig deeper, what we discover will determine if and what work is needed, but nothing will be slowing down the assembly once those issues are overcome. And just like that, 2 out of the 4 things are done. There's some dead weight items on the block like the timing engine mount bracket and the power steering pump belt. I'm going to completely rebuild this power steering pump. That should be a fun video. I've rebuilt a 2G pump before, and these are very different, so it'll be new territory for me in a way. We're done with the hoist for now, so let's make some room to start cleaning. One of the things that I've never used to clean the outside of an engine with before is a shop vac. I have to confess that I felt a little bit stupid doing this at first on camera, but I was reassured by a guy who often wears the farm mechanic hat and splits filthy tractors in half that a screwdriver in a shop vac is where he always starts on all of his rebuilds. It made me feel better, and then I remembered that Lamborghinis are tractors too, so this isn't weird. Evicted. Now let us establish a nice disposable platform to make this mess on. This is the perfect thing to do with that random TV box you've been meaning to throw away. As I clean and break this thing down, I'm only going to make more and more of a mess, so being able to fold that mess up and remove it later is key to me. I'm just using mineral spirits whenever you see this brush in my hand. Apparently this valve cover has paint on it. Mineral spirits doesn't remove paint. Not very well anyway. I'll get to spend a little bit of extra time on this later. This is all stuff that I don't feel like cleaning. We'll see what I keep from all of this. It might be the original equipment, but I think I can do better in some places. I don't feel like breaking every little piece of this stuff apart, so I'm just going to remove each thing that I can as a whole assembly. If you have a variety of sockets, extensions, and ratchets, it's really the easiest way to remove it all. Gear wrenches are your friends, but they can quickly become your enemy here if you're trying to install it, and they're not reversible gear wrenches. And don't say you weren't warned. I guarantee you that there are people driving around on the road with permanently installed gear wrenches on their exhaust manifolds trapped between the stud and the exhaust turbine housing. In fact, I should probably do that to the Hyundai just for fun. We're beyond the manifold nuts now. There's a couple of 10mm oil drain bolts on the factory turbo's hard return line. And next, of course, is the oil feed line. I just cut all the coolant lines, and why waste my time dancing around the clips with all these parts still in the way if I'm just going to replace the lines anyway. So there you go. Last two nuts. And
I forgot 1G.
Yep, I sure did. I forgot 1G. Cut me some slack. I started out on a second-gen car. I often do things the 2G way, even on 1G cars, so there's a hard coolant return line threaded into the water pipe on a 1G. It's neat, totally over-engineered, but it's cool. Oh yeah, and some cars that haven't broken it off have a little teeny bolt securing a coolant line to the turbo. Got that one. Now, assembly. Gone. Behold! The next thing to go is all the coolant stuff, and it's easier to get to it now. It's not just the water pipe. There's a hard coolant feed line that goes all the way to the oil filter housing bolted to the block. There's two bolts, but one's gone because it's supposed to be bolted to the exhaust support bracket that's missing. And hey, I recognize that. That's the bolt that holds the exhaust up. It's been there for 20 years. So anyway, to take the water pipe off the thing, the thermostat housing goes first and doesn't put up a fight, but I antagonized it with a mallet anyway. This thing's going to be a whole lot of fun to clean up, man. Next, you have to remove a coolant return hose for the oil filter housing, and again, I'm just cutting those hoses. Might as well cut the one on the oil filter housing while I'm at it. Pull the bolt, and there it goes. The dipstick tube goes away too, and now with the water pipe out of the way, the rest of the power steering pump and bracketry can all come flying off of here. Look, I don't have a cool story to tell about every single thing. How do you make this interesting? I've never had any trouble removing any of this stuff before, and that's really boring. But there you go. Couple of big bolts on the front engine mount gives it its freedom. Keep it rolling. The alternator's still all bolted down tight because I pulled its belt off by removing the crank pulley. I'll tell you what, if I had to replace this thing with the engine in the car, I really don't think I could have done it. There would have been absolutely no way to get this bolt out. I burned up 16 minutes on a memory card just swinging the hammer. And there would have been no room to do anything like that with the radiator and the hot side obstructing my swing. You couldn't cut it out either because the alternator's got an ear on both sides of the thing bolted through it, blocking it. Even with the engine out of the car, just like Marion Cobretti, I used everything I had. But I actually have to save this part, so that's why you see me being careful putting a nut on the end of it first. Seriously, this went on for way too long. And thank goodness that's over with. I was worried that the front case would be permanently padlocked to the block by the alternator and be the end of this series. Sorry, Tubes, can't rebuild this one because the alternator bolt. The fuel system's easy though, 3 bolts and a vacuum hose. The intake manifold is next. Nothing fancy about this one either. The flange bolts are the only things holding everything on the side of the engine, so I've made videos about my cleanup process and don't need to do that narration. Rojo Del Chocolate volunteered to carry us through this, so let's just sit back and enjoy this oddly satisfying cleaning montage, shall we? too bad. No go! Now you see why I wanted to do this anyway. These pulleys don't last forever, and that would wear out the belt really fast. Looks like all the rest of the steel stuff here is rusted, and I don't really care because it's all the stuff I have to replace anyway. Some parts have been updated, but this doesn't scare me. There's clearly been a lot of leakage in here, and I don't doubt that every single seal on this thing is hard as a rock or turned into a sponge by now. It looks to me like a Felpro gasket set was used, and it looks about par for the course after 20 years. Timing belt's in the way of pulling the head off, but before I pull it, I figured I'd try to get this alternator tensioner bracket off the water pump first. It's annoying. The only problem is the bolt it's on. It's well past the threads, but it's still stuck in the water pump really good. Come on, man. Give me the tensioner arm back. Drop it. Drop it. Suit your stubborn self. You've got one coming, buddy. Now, where were we? Oh yeah. Crank sprocket bolts munged, so this is all that I have that fits it. It's a 12.78 inch. The 6-point doesn't fit it. I don't know. What I'm about to show you I haven't had on my channel before. This engine has balance shafts still installed and working. If you're putting one like this at top dead center, there are 5 timing marks to look out for. You got the one front balance shaft aligning with the engine's front case mark right there. You have the one on the timing gears right here. There's an extra pair of these on the outer side of the gears, and if you look at it straight on with a straight edge across them, you'll understand. You've got the one on the oil pump gear, which drives the rear balance shaft through gear reduction. And then you got this one here on the crank pulley. They don't all have to be aligned before you remove the belt if you're rebuilding it. But if you're servicing it, you do. Let me demonstrate my own special patented timing belt tool. Now, that water pump knows I'm coming for it. So the timing tensioner has to go. The timing mount and the timing tensioner assembly also have to go. And now that those are gone, let's see here. Yeah, we got the timing belt cover plate. It's just you and me, buddy. Be ready for a mess if there should be one. No? No mess? Alright. You just sit right there and think about what you did. I got a score to settle with the oil filter housing first. The water pump just saw me whack its friend, and I'm going to clean up bolts like nothing ever happened and just let him sit there and decide if he wants to cooperate or not. This is just one of my special intimidation tactics I occasionally have to call on for stuck bolts. The world is a terrible place sometimes. Now, Mr. Water Pump, I'll be nice and use the little punch, but the hammers are only going to get bigger until you cooperate. So let go. I'm trying to be nice here and give you another chance. Oh, you want to be a wise guy, eh?
Cut his freaking head off!
Now, give me my arm back. You're not so special. You're replaceable. And maybe that was the plan all along. It's like a war scene on this exhaust flange here. Bits of shrapnel from a misfired modification. Over-tightening exhaust nuts can rip the threads out of the head. Or worse. Stainless steel studs are nice in that they're easier to install and remove your turbo in most cases because they don't corrode. But only get the 12-point version. The 6-point version uses lock nuts that can seize on the studs and drive the stud deeper into the head. If it's a flared stud, in other words shaped like the factory stud with the bump in the middle of it, then this can happen. It's fixable, but notice what those nuts also do to the stainless steel stud. They're galled up terrible. Now that the engine is clean and stuff is out of the way, I was finally able to see the serial number on the block. And I'm feeling really lucky right now because this revelation proves to me that this is a numbers matching car. So far, every single detail relayed to me by the previous owner is 100% spot on, including the stories told to him. So let's see what's on the inside, shall we? I'm dying to see more of this. So what I do know is that the head was removed, yes, but this car got bought and sold a few times. Its maintenance schedule apparently wasn't followed by one of the owners, and it suffered some kind of timing belt failure. Bought, rebuilt, and sold. So basically, timing belt special is what they call that. First evidence of the story is correct because the ARP head studs. The factory uses head bolts. I just use a pry bar against the timing mount stud to break the head loose so that I can easily lift it and carry it away. I do remember that being more difficult to do with ARP head studs, and it took me a second to figure out why. I've read about these, but I've never actually seen them in person before. I've also never seen head studs installed this incorrectly before. Each one was honked all the way in, tightly using a pair of pliers around the shank. Failed badly at step 4 in the included instructions, but this is an interesting part selection that I actually agree with for this car. These are undercut 12mm ARP head studs. They're the 207-4701s, not the 207-4702s that everyone else sells. You can see where they're undercut above the threads where they screw into the block. They both share the same installation instructions, torque loads, materials, everything. But the undercut stud is a millimeter smaller up the shank so that the bolt stretches more. That sounds like a bad thing, right? Why would you want your head bolts to stretch? Well, head bolt stretch is actually what keeps your head bolted down tight. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing in most applications, and here's why. If the head gasket becomes crushed, even smaller than when it's torqued, by a rigid stud that doesn't stretch enough, when the head gets hot and swells up from thermal expansion, then it could fail to seal after it cools down, leaving you with a loss of compression on a cold engine. Some gaskets crush more than others, especially concerning composite gaskets. They can crush by up to 15 thousandths of an inch, or almost 4/10ths of a millimeter from just a heat cycle. So if you need to retorque your fasteners after heat cycling, that's due to a property of the head gasket more than it is the fasteners. Just so you know. So here's the block. What? 8 fly cuts is totally normal, isn't it? Some of them have only 6, or one of them I should say. Pretty clear that this thing ate a whole valve train. History confirmed. Original pistons. Markings indicate standard bore. Wouldn't be surprised if they have the same factory rods too. These pistons like to shatter if they're pressed off the pins, and it's pretty clear that none of the pistons were ever replaced. This isn't terribly uncommon to find. Many people have fixed timing belts and driven around on them like that for over 100,000 miles with their pistons looking just like these. Despite what we might find wrong, remember that this engine went 50,000 miles after it was put back together, so I really can't say anything bad about anybody's efforts here. I'm glad I have a complete engine that ran. As we peel layers of this onion back, there's plenty more stuff to clean. Brushing parts down prior to using the siphon feed blowgun saves a whole lot of time and mineral spirits. With the head off, we're in the finishing stretch. All that's left is the crank sprocket, the front case, oil pan, rod caps, and main caps, and I've got it all broken down. All that's left. I did it. Don't say encouraging things to yourself while you're working. You'll curse yourself every single time. Just shut up and keep working instead. This crank pulley bolt. I tried the Harbor Freight Earthquake. I tried the wrong lubricant inside the Harbor Freight Impact to try to boost its compression. I tried it from a full compressor tank. I tried the DeWalt half-inch drive with a fully charged battery. Nope. You might notice that I managed to lightly hammer a 22mm socket over the crank bolt to get a grip on it. I tried threading 2 crank bolts and bracing it with a pry bar on the other side of the crankshaft. I tried using a breaker bar with all my weight. I tried using a breaker bar and a pipe. I tried using a breaker bar and a pipe. I tried using a breaker bar and a pipe. I tried not trying anything else until I could go to the grocery store and buy another propane cylinder. I was out. That's my fault. Jaffro tries fire. At this point, I suspected this crank pulley bolt was installed with red Loctite. If so, propane isn't the fastest thing to break it with, but it'll work. It lets go above 500 degrees, but I'd rather sneak up on it with a colder flame than cook these parts. I even called in for reinforcements and tried a half-inch air cat. I tried a half-inch air cat with the correct air tool oil with no success. The first time I heated the bolt, I waited about 10 minutes while my compressor charged. If you heat the bolt like this, the bolt swells instead of the hole, so you should wait. Let the heat soak into the hole. It took my compressor about 10 minutes to charge up, but you know that stuff gets edited out. From here on out, because of how thermal expansion works, try to focus on heating the hole. I tried shocking it with penetrating oil. Oil chases heat, and we know this is the good stuff. This hand down the borehole thing isn't good for the rotating assembly, but neither was chewing up 14 valves, so this isn't what hurts it. But back to the pry bar crank brace and the breaker bar again. Now to fully drain my air compressor tank with the air cat. Okay, fine. More fire. I'm going to get it as hot as I can get it with the propane and get as much leverage as I can without taking it off the engine stand. I've tried hitting it with all of the air ratchets, from completely full compressor tank and penetrating oil's heat, cooling it rapidly with water. I tried heat and lubricants with the most powerful air ratchet available to me, so leverage is the only way I'm ever going to get it loose.
Oh, I got it! Yes! Yes! Yep, lock tight.
Keeping a propane or MAP gas torch in the shop is like keeping fresh milk in the fridge, except that it makes fire, and that's way cooler than milk. You'll definitely learn how to take some stuck bolts loose disassembling 30-year-old engines. There's a puller tool for the crank sprocket, but just grab your garage milk and heat the hole. In this case, the sprocket. Just because it doesn't look hot doesn't mean anything. There you go. No fighting it. Garage groceries. Finally, with that settled, only an oil pan, the pickup, and the balance shaft belt separates us from busting this front case off of here. With the bouncer belt and gear gone, let's clear a path to make a mess. But real quick, one thing I didn't show you earlier because I wanted to get through that edit. If you were looking closely, you probably saw it.
Ooh. Ooh.
Whatever failure happened to the timing belt, or I don't know what happened here, something tried to fight for its life, I know that much. It was bad. All the sharp stuff is polished smooth by the belt.
Good.
I dug the belt out of the trash and noticed that there's a wear pattern that repeated identically every 4 teeth. So if you ever find a wear pattern on your belt that happens every 4 teeth, you know it's coming from the crank sprocket, even if you can't get eyes on it. Fortunately, I'm that random dude with anything the car might ever need already screwed to my garage wall. Multiples even. Come to think of it, the belt spacer plate was messed up too, so I'll go ahead and grab that one. I thought that felt a little bit heavier than it should be. I had a few of them stuck together. Now, to flip the block over without making a mess. 17 oil pan bolts left to get the oil pan off, and once it lets go of the front case and the rear main seal housing, both of those will be a whole lot easier to remove. I've used this oil pan separator tool on a different occasion, and I love this thing. I think I paid about 20 bucks shipped for it. It's not the OTC version, this is just the cheap one. I actually like the cheap one better because it has an angled striking surface for no-handed operation once you get it going. It takes all the struggle and the oil pan damage right out of the equation. I don't know what this is. It looks like aluminum, but it has squared edges and it's perfectly rectangular. Just curled up. A couple other pieces of the same kind of material like this, so 3 total, but most of this just feels like carbon grit. Stuff you'd expect to find collected in a 30-year-old car that sat for 15 years. Man, and a whole lot of RTV. The oil pickup screen's got to go first, or else you won't have any fun taking that front case off. And you can see this car has the factory main bolts, rod bolts, and everything else in it. The rods, everything else is bone stock. Before I take the pistons and the rods out, I need to mark their orientation because I don't know what I'm going to find in here. Most people do that to the rods when they remove them, and there are no markings of any kinds on these. So, anyway, slap the nuts, no fight left in her after that. Use your hammer handle to tap the piston out of the hole against the end of the rod bolt, not the bearing surface or on the parting line. I've been inspecting each one of these factory rods and pistons, and so far they actually look better than everything else that I've found bolted to this crankshaft. I mean, for what they've been through, these aren't even tri-metal bearings. We'll get a better look at all of these things when they've been cleaned up. Yeah, not too bad. I mean, it was a running, driving car, so it should be, and it is. Crank feels great, flipping around with one finger. The only way to get the crank out is to remove the front case. Do the big bolt first because it has the most torque on it. Get the balancer belt, tensioner pulley next. Yeah, I put way more thought into the front case bolt removal process than I should. Then you do the front shaft bolts, and then the outside of the oil pump bolts, and anyway, I like to be careful with the front case, so I'm going to start off light and tap the bottom of the front case loose with a mallet. There's a nice reinforced edge on the front of the block too, and it looks like I've got it moving, but she's still stuck good. It's not because of the balance shafts. Alright, fine, it's pry bar time after all. I really didn't want to do it, but I've softened it up enough. Whoever did this did it right. It's only on one side of the gasket. It's just a whole lot of RTV though. I just removed the whole front case and balance shafts as an assembly. I'll do all the rest of it on my workbench. The crank comes loose in reverse torque sequence, but other than that I'm not really being very careful at all. You can see I'm using an impact. I usually do all this stuff by hand. Savor the aroma, man. That pungency. Alright, that's enough. Now to get the main caps off, and the first thing you grab is the main bolts. You squeeze them together, you pull up, and then you beat on your fingers really hard with a plastic mallet. That makes the rest of removing a 6-bolt center main a whole lot more enjoyable afterwards. So if this happens to you and your 6-bolt 4G63, just take the suitcase handles off first by giving each one a whack on the back of the handles. And then you can keep tackling with a mallet on the center main if you want, but the easiest way is just to lift up about 1/4 of an inch on the snout of the crankshaft and it lets go. It's actually a great thing for the health of your engine if that center main puts up a big old fight and is difficult to separate, so be happy if it does that to you. It's a good thing. I forgot the crank bolts where we were prying against, and yeah, I want to keep my fingers while we lift the crank out and set it aside. Yay! Full teardown in one video narrated this time. Only things left are the oil squirters. There's 4 of them and they're expensive to replace, so hopefully they'll all clean up just fine. A knock sensor. And you should have a 24mm slotted socket to avoid damaging yours because they're out of production for 1G cars now. The dowel pins are all going to get replaced with brand new ones, and the freeze plugs I'm going to leave in place for now because I've got some more stuff I want to do first. I have a lot of decisions to make. I want to inspect the bores and see where everything is before I fully make up my mind on how to proceed. I'll do everything I can to save the head. I'm cleaning up all this stuff while you guys hit that like button and leave a comment. Tell me what you think about this Japanese antique. What would you do with it? What's that? Don't end the video now? Not yet? But oh, people are going to want to base their decision off more info than that, aren't they? Yeah, okay. Alright, well, since they're going to go through all the trouble of commenting, I might as well. The clock says 158,900 miles. This is what the bores look like. No reason to believe it's any more or less than that, or that any other pistons ever lived here. The cross-hatching looks pretty good, but you can see that the ring lands at the tops and bottoms of the bores look worn. Pretty rusty and pitted above the ring lands. To get the full picture, we'd have to measure each piston and the length of each bore to see how it's worn. That's what I meant when I said that the car is going to get only what it asks for. Then, we've got the mains on the block, which I'm not even going to bother measuring because we're not going to use the same bearings here. I'm going to use a tri-metal ACL bearing because I want bearings that can handle all the cylinder pressures the turbo can produce. But I will measure the crankshaft and I will measure the pistons and bores. I want to be in front of my whiteboard when I do this and under better lighting, so let's scrape all the gaskets and give it a bath first. Yeah, I don't want to track this mess into that clean room. Now begins the end of 4 razor blades, all the funk on 3 of the block's flange surfaces, several thousand watts on my electricity meter, 2 hours of patience, and 3 memory cards. You get to see this part in a minute per second. The razor blade cleanup is actually one of my favorite parts to do because of how much it reveals. It is definitely the slow method, but it's the least destructive method of all that you could employ to do this. I don't like using bristle discs or rotary tools to clean up my own personal engine's flange surfaces. That's stuff for people paid by the hour or by the job. On my own cars, I prefer to maintain everything about what the factory put there, all the way down to the texture, and only because I'm a purist like that. These surfaces were milled flat, so, a razor blade edge will reveal every single imperfection without removing any material other than surface rust. Because the razor blade edge is flat, you clean and check the flange surfaces both in one step. I find that when I install factory gaskets with the factory recommended sealants and procedures, I want a clean flange that my engines don't leak. Except for the dang oil filter housings. These things are terrible like that. I don't know if they can even be helped, but sometimes I just have to hit them with a hammer. I don't want to get the clean room filthy, but in all truthfulness, a year later that room only has the illusion of being clean. It needs work. I'm still going to do my part to prevent it from getting any worse. Now the block gets to hang out in here for now. It's so lucky. I'm going to need a crank and rods for this too. I don't plan on doing too much to any of them just to get the oil and the loose carbon off. All I need to do is measure these parts to get the specs. I don't need them to be ready to install. I want to avoid handling them, getting greasy, and then getting everything else in there greasy, you know what I mean? So now here we are in the clean room with all the degreased parts. You can see the mics are out, and I've already taken all of my piston and crankshaft measurements and written them up there on the whiteboard. This is how the rotating assembly looks after 159,000 miles. You can see from the crankshaft main specification that all of those are spot on. The rod journal specifications are 1.7709 to 1.7717, and you don't need to worry about number 3 there. Number 3's fine. The crankshaft looks fantastic. But one of the things that I didn't expect was for the pistons to be all nearly exactly the same size. Things didn't work out like that on my GSX at all. The sizes of my forged pistons were all over the place when I was done with that block, and that was only 48,000 miles. The only thing that I'm worried about here is the piston to cylinder wall clearance that I measure in the block. With a factory piston, this clearance is supposed to be 12 10,000ths to 20 10,000ths of an inch. So what I'm going to do is use my brand new digital bore gauge to measure the piston to cylinder wall clearances. This is an SPI unit, and I picked it up from MSC Tools. They're about $300 shipped. With it zeroed to the piston size, this gauge measures the difference between the part and the hole. So basically it gives us the piston to cylinder wall clearance. Right off the bat, it's apparent that this bore is worn well beyond spec, so I've got my serious scrutinizing face on while I look at this. In fact, as I went through all of these measurements, a third of them were at least double the factory spec and over the service limit. The cylindricity of all of the bores are also out of spec. Work in whatever units of measurement you want, it doesn't change the outcome here. What I see here is that I got a perfectly good crank, the block is not too far out from spec. No, there's no torque plate involved here with this test, but it wouldn't affect these numbers enough to fix anything if it were bolted down right now, because it wouldn't make these holes any smaller. The number one measurement is the top of the bore. Y is the thrust angle, and that's why all the Y measurements are bigger. X is the one parallel to the crank. Also, the number 4 measurements are all a 10,000th of an inch smaller than they should be because I didn't reset the bore gauge for that one piston that was only a 10th smaller. Who would have guessed that the rotating assembly specs would all be within 2 10,000ths of an inch, but that it would be the bores that were all over the place? You've seen enough of my videos to know what to think of these numbers, and I hope that my efforts here help paint the full picture. I think I now know what I want to do, but it isn't building the fastest Galant in the world. I want to drive this and enjoy it, but tell me in the comments, if this was your block, what would you do to it? Hit that like button while you're down there, and if you didn't watch the other video first, don't forget you got another one to enjoy. I hope you've enjoyed this forensic episode as much as I have making it. Thank you for taking the time to become a part of this car story, and I'll have more coming soon, but until then, stay tuned.